Get these two out of here. This cabin isn't for people like them. The words didn't crack. They landed solid, deliberate, and loud enough for the entire first-class cabin to hear. Lisa Harper, the lead flight attendant on Skylux Flight 318, stood with one hand on her hip, the other pointing squarely at a black mother and her 12-year-old daughter seated quietly in seats 1A and 1B. Her voice carried that polished edge, the kind that pretends to be professional, but isn't. Behind her, another flight attendant smirked. A white businessman in seat 1C chuckled and sipped champagne. And just like that, what should have been a simple family vacation turned into a public reckoning. Before we dive in, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments. And if this moment hit you, like and subscribe. Your support keeps these stories alive. Now let's rewind just a few minutes, because what happened next would shake an airline to its core. The cabin doors had barely closed when Michelle Carter stepped into the first-class aisle with her daughter, Kayla, right by her side, dressed in a soft beige travel coat and simple flats. Michelle wasn't trying to make a statement. She wasn't here on business. She was here as a mother, celebrating her daughter's recent win in a statewide swim competition. Kayla had placed first, and her father, David Carter, the CEO of Skylux Airlines, had surprised them both with first-class tickets to Paris. It was supposed to be a mother-daughter trip, full of museums and croissants and walks along the Seine, but as soon as Michelle and Kayla settled into their seats, the mood in the cabin shifted. It started with the looks. Lisa Harper, in her crisp Navy uniform, didn't even offer a greeting. She simply stared. Then came Sarah Mitchell, younger, with that same tight-lipped expression. They exchanged a glance, and before Michelle could even buckle her belt, Lisa was standing over her. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to leave this cabin," she said flatly, arms crossed. "These seats are reserved for our top-tier clients." Michelle blinked. "I believe there's a mistake. These are our assigned seats." She showed her ticket, calm but firm. Lisa didn't even look down. "I don't think so. You'll need to move." From across the aisle, a white man in a tailored gray suit spoke up, Charles Wentworth, as they'd later learn. "You can't expect them to know how this works," he said, loud enough for several rows to hear. "People like them never fly first." That's when Sarah chimed in, half smiling. "This cabin is reserved for premium passengers, real VIPs." The air turned cold. Michelle's hands gripped Kayla's. Her daughter, wide-eyed and quiet, whispered, "Mom, did we do something wrong?" "Not at all, baby," Michelle said, forcing calm into her voice. "We belong here." Emma Larson, a woman in her 30s sitting a few rows back, looked up from her seat and frowned. "This doesn't feel right," she murmured, just loud enough for Sarah to hear. But Lisa didn't care. "Unless you can prove you're on the manifest, I suggest you move to coach." She snapped. Kayla's fingers tightened. "I don't want to go. Mom, I'm scared." Michelle leaned in close to her daughter and whispered, "It's going to be okay." Then she reached for her phone. "Call your dad," she told Kayla quietly. "Tell him we're being asked to leave." "Your dad?" Sarah sneered. "That won't help you." Michelle brought the phone to her ear. "David, we have a problem." On the other end, her husband, the CEO of the very airline they were flying, was in a morning meeting. He didn't ask for details. "I'll be there," he said. "Don't move. Don't let anyone touch you." As Michelle ended the call, Lisa was already back, holding a printed manifest. "You're not listed here," she said. "Now please stand." Emma stood from her seat. "This is harassment," she said, her voice raised now. "They've done nothing wrong." Behind Lisa, Sarah rolled her eyes. "This is above your pay grade. Ma'am, please return to your seat." But Emma didn't move. Neither did Jaden Brooks. a young black trainee flight attendant near the galley, who looked shaken but nodded subtly toward Michelle in support. "They deserve to be here," he murmured. "I saw the tickets." "Quiet. Jaden," Lisa barked. "This doesn't concern you." "It does now," Michelle said, her voice rising. "You're humiliating my daughter." "Your daughter should be used to disappointment," Charles muttered into his glass. "You can't just walk into a space like this and expect to be treated like royalty." Michelle stood up. "I don't need to be royalty to be treated with decency." Lisa leaned in, voice low but still audible. "This isn't about decency. This is about standards. And frankly, you don't meet them." The words sat there for a moment, bitter and raw. Kayla's eyes brimmed with tears. "Why are they saying this to us?" she whispered. Emma moved closer. "You're not alone," she said. "This isn't right, and we all see it." Lisa ignored her. "Security will be here soon," she said, and turned on her heel. Michelle sat back down. Kayla clutched her arm. "Mom, what if they make us leave?" "Then they'll answer for it," Michelle whispered. She looked down at her phone. Her husband's location showed him en route to the terminal. Her hands were shaking, but not with fear, with fury. She had been quiet for too long, too polite, but not today. "You'll regret this, Lisa," Michelle said loud enough for the cabin to hear. Lisa paused at the galley. "Is that a threat?" "No," Michelle said calmly. "That's a promise." The passengers around her, some silent, some uncomfortable, began to shift. A few looked up from their devices. One or two glanced at their own ticket stubs, as if questioning the integrity of what they'd just witnessed. Jaden stood near the curtain, watching, his hands trembling. "They have a right to be here," he said again. This time louder. Lisa didn't respond. Neither did Sarah. But Charles snorted. "She's just some freeloader trying to play the system." "You don't belong here," Sarah added. "Not people like you." And then came the moment that changed everything. Lisa walked back down the aisle, leaned close to Michelle and said, in a tone meant only for her, but overheard by half the cabin, "This airline wasn't built for people like you. Know your place." Kayla let out a soft sob. Michelle didn't blink. She placed a calming hand on her daughter's shoulder, then stood again. "You're destroying Skylux," she said, her voice steady, no longer asking for fairness, but demanding accountability. Behind her, Emma stood. Jaden stood. A few other passengers slowly rose, saying nothing, but making it clear the line had been crossed, and the clock had just started ticking. "Attention all passengers seated in rows 1A and 1B. Please vacate your seats immediately so we may accommodate a Skylux VIP guest." The words blared through the intercom like a public branding, echoing across the polished first-class cabin. Michelle Carter froze, her daughter Kayla's hand tightening around hers. They were the only passengers in 1A and 1B. There was no doubt who the message was aimed at. The gasps were quiet but sharp. Even those who had been pretending not to notice the tension turned their heads. Lisa Harper stood behind the curtain, smug, watching her words humiliate a mother and child. Sarah Mitchell stood at her side, arms crossed and smirking as if the announcement was some kind of joke. "They don't meet the standard," she whispered to a male passenger in row 2. "It's not personal. It's about image." Kayla looked up at her mother with red, frightened eyes. "Mom, are we getting kicked out?" Michelle bent down and whispered gently. "No, baby. We're right where we're supposed to be." But inside, her chest burned. The same airline her husband ran was now parading her and her daughter as unworthy, right in front of strangers. From across the aisle, Charles Wentworth leaned over the armrest. "I paid for peace and class," he said, loud and unbothered. not to sit next to people who clearly snuck their way in. Michelle's voice cracked just a little, but she didn't look at him. We didn't sneak in. We paid, like everyone else. Sure you did, he replied with a smirk. Just like I believe in the Easter Bunny. At that moment, Emma Larson, seated just behind them, stood up. This is disgusting, she said. You're embarrassing a mother and child for what? So a VIP can be more comfortable? Sarah's tone sharpened. Ma'am, you're not part of this. Please return to your seat. I am now, Emma snapped. You made this public when you used the intercom to announce it. In the rear galley, Jaden Brooks peeked through the curtain. He had heard every word. Lisa had bullied him in training, subtle jabs about his tone, offhand remarks about how lucky he was to be hired. He had kept his head down, until now. They deserve to be here, he said softly, stepping into the aisle. They have first-class tickets. I verified them myself. Lisa turned sharply. Go back to the galley. Jaden, this doesn't involve you. Yes, it does, he replied. You're crossing the line. Kayla wiped her face with the sleeve of her hoodie. I just want to go home, she whispered, her voice trembling. Michelle shook her head. No. Sweetheart, we're not leaving. She pulled out her phone again. David, it's getting worse. They're humiliating Kayla now. They made a cabin-wide announcement. On the other end, David Carter's voice was steady but clipped. I'm almost there. Don't move. Don't let anyone put their hands on either of you. Michelle tucked the phone away, her eyes locked on Lisa's. You should be very careful with what happens next. Lisa raised a brow. Is that a threat, ma'am? No, Michelle said plainly. It's a warning. Sarah leaned down toward Kayla. Don't worry, sweetie. The seats back in coach aren't that bad. Kayla recoiled, and Michelle stood up so fast her purse slid off her lap and hit the floor. Don't talk to my daughter. The passengers were no longer silent. Murmurs ran through the cabin. Phones came out, not filming yet, but ready. One man in 2A shook his head. This is going too far. Emma nodded. It's racism, plain and simple. Lisa waved her hand. This is a customer service matter, Jaden added. No, it's a character issue, and everyone can see it now. Charles, now fully irritated, leaned forward again. The longer they stay here, the more Skylux loses its appeal. I pay for exclusivity, not charity. Michelle narrowed her eyes. Say another word about my daughter, and I swear, you'll regret it. Enough, Lisa snapped. This ends now. She motioned toward the cockpit, then turned back. Security will handle this. Michelle sat down again and gently pulled Kayla close. We're not moving, she said. No matter what they say. Emma stepped forward again. You're not alone, and we're not going to sit by while this happens. Lisa scoffed. You can't tell us how to manage our aircraft. I'm not trying to, Emma replied. I'm trying to remind you that human decency should never be optional. Jaden, still in uniform, stood tall beside her. And treating people like they don't belong, just because they don't look like your usual VIPs, that's a choice you're making in front of a full cabin. Sarah chuckled. Let's be honest. We all know why she's really upset. Why's that? Emma shot back. Because she's black? Sarah blinked, stunned that someone had said it aloud. I didn't say that. You didn't have to, Emma said. Michelle looked around the cabin, at the passengers shifting uncomfortably, some speaking in low voices, others now visibly angry. She saw the way Jaden's hands shook as he stood up for her. She saw Kayla's tear-streaked face, red and humiliated, trying to understand what she had done to deserve this. And most of all, she felt that old familiar ache of having to explain to a child that sometimes Dignity is stripped away in the places where you've paid for comfort. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the printed itinerary. Here, she said, holding it up. My name is Michelle Carter. My husband is David Carter, your CEO. And these are our seats. Now you serve us, or you face the consequences. Sarah's smirk vanished. Lisa went pale. Charles froze. Emma stepped closer to Michelle. Say it again. Say your name louder. Michelle Carter, she said, wife of David Carter. And if you want to keep your jobs, I suggest you act like it. Lisa scoffed, still clinging to her posture. Nice bluff. Michelle tilted her head. You sure you want to bet your career on that? Jaden nodded. She's telling the truth. More murmurs. A couple of passengers began whispering among themselves. One woman in a red blazer raised her phone, not to record, but to type. The tension in the cabin began to shift. Michelle sat back down beside Kayla and gently brushed a curl off her daughter's forehead. You did nothing wrong, she said quietly. I'll fix this. Lisa stepped back, faltering for the first time. Sarah looked to her, then to the cockpit. What do we do now? She asked under her breath. Lisa swallowed hard, unsure. Wait for confirmation. In the silence that followed. It wasn't just the crew waiting. The whole cabin was waiting. For the truth. For justice. For the moment someone would finally be held accountable. Security, prepare to remove them now. The words dropped like a hammer, louder than the hum of the engines, louder than the whispers that had started rippling through the cabin. Lisa Harper stood in the aisle with her hand on her radio, voice firm and deliberate, as if she were announcing a safety procedure instead of trying to eject a mother and her 12-year-old daughter from first class. We've got a disruption in row 1, she added, not even glancing at Michelle or Kayla as she radioed the cockpit. Sarah Mitchell, now emboldened by the threat of security, stepped forward and sneered. Can you even afford to be here? Be honest. Her voice carried, just like Lisa's. It was no longer subtle. It was public humiliation in real time. Charles Wentworth shifted in his seat and added with a scoff. This is what happens when you start letting just anyone in. Kayla, trembling, buried her face into her mother's side. Why do they hate us? Mom, she whispered, tears soaking through Michelle's coat. And that was it. That was the moment Michelle stood up, not with rage, not with theatrics, but with a calm that felt like thunder. This is your last chance to back down, she said to Lisa, her voice steady, her eyes locked in. What you're doing is discriminatory, reckless, and about to cost all of you more than your jobs. Lisa didn't flinch. You're trespassing in a space that isn't yours. Now move, or we'll move you. Michelle didn't budge. These seats were paid for. My name is Michelle Carter. My husband is David Carter. He's the CEO of this airline. And he's almost here. Lisa scoffed. Sure he is. She motioned to Sarah, who was already speaking into her headset. Security is on standby. Good, Michelle replied, because I want them to see this for themselves. Emma Larson, now standing directly behind Michelle, raised her voice. This woman has done nothing wrong. Neither has her daughter. This is a disgrace. A few passengers in nearby rows began to speak out too. She said they're the CEO's family. Why isn't anyone checking that? Why are you only going after them? Where's your proof they don't belong? Jaden Brooks, still in uniform and still visibly nervous, took a bold step forward from the galley. They're not lying. I saw their names on the manifest when they boarded. Those seats were booked days ago. Sarah turned toward him, jaw tight. You're out of line. No, he said, louder this time. You are. Lisa ignored him. She turned back toward the cockpit, signaling for the flight marshal. Michelle stepped slightly in front of Kayla, shielding her. "You're not laying a hand on my child," she said, quiet but deadly serious. And for a moment, no one moved. It was as if time paused inside the sleek first-class cabin. The air was too thick, the silence too loud. Emma finally broke it. "You're not calling security to protect passengers. You're calling them to cover your mistake." Sarah laughed under her breath. "Mistake? No. We're protecting the integrity of this cabin." "The integrity?" Michelle repeated, turning toward her. "You think mocking a child and ejecting a paying passenger protects your brand? You've humiliated us, in front of everyone." Charles, sipping what was left of his champagne, muttered, "She's just looking for attention." "I didn't ask for any of this," Michelle shot back. "I was trying to take my daughter on vacation." Kayla, her voice soft and shaken, whispered, "Can Dad come now?" "He's on his way," Michelle replied, rubbing her daughter's back gently. "He's almost here." At that, Lisa turned back toward the cockpit and hissed into her mic. "We need confirmation of this so-called CEO's wife now." But the cracks were already forming. The confidence on her face was starting to unravel. Jaden, still standing in the aisle, said clearly, "You called me unprofessional in training. You said I wasn't a good fit for Skylux culture. But if this," he motioned toward Michelle and Kayla, "if this is your idea of professionalism, then maybe I don't want to fit in." A murmur of agreement moved through the cabin. One older man in the back row muttered, "It's always the same story," a woman in a blue sweater whispered. "I'm so ashamed this is happening." Michelle pulled out her phone and hit record. She held it up just slightly and aimed it at Sarah. "Say it again," she said. Sarah blinked. "Say what?" "What you just said. That I don't belong here. That I can't afford this seat. Say it on camera." Sarah's mouth opened, then closed. "That's what I thought," Michelle said, lowering the phone. Emma stepped forward again. "Everyone in this cabin saw what just happened, and they're all going to remember it." Kayla gripped her mother's hand. "Mom, I think he's here." A hush rolled over the cabin as a tall man in a dark gray suit stepped into the aisle. David Carter. His badge, visible for anyone paying attention, read Skylux Executive Access. But his presence said more than any ID ever could. He walked directly down the aisle, not saying a word, not making a scene, just eyes forward, face tight with disbelief, and a storm behind every step. Lisa turned and stiffened. "Sir, this area is—" "My name," he interrupted, "is David Carter, CEO of Skylux Airlines. And you," he said, pointing to Lisa and then Sarah, "have about 3 seconds to explain why you've been harassing my wife and daughter." The color drained from Sarah's face. Lisa opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Charles, halfway through another insult, lowered his glass and sat back. David moved next to Michelle and Kayla, pulling them both into his arms. "Are you okay?" he asked gently. Michelle nodded. "We're fine now." Then David stood tall and turned back toward the crew. "You're both relieved of duty. Immediately. This flight is grounded until further notice." Passengers gasped. Emma put a hand to her chest. Jaden looked down, stunned. Sarah stammered. "Sir, it was a misunderstanding." "No," David snapped. "It was a humiliation, and you'll answer for it." He turned to Charles. "And your partnership with Skylux? Cancelled, effective immediately." Charles stood abruptly, sputtering. "You can't do that." "I just did," David said coldly. "Now get off my aircraft." Charles stormed past the other passengers, red-faced and silent. Lisa stepped backward toward the galley, whispering to Sarah. "I didn't know who she was." "That's the problem," David replied without turning. "You didn't care to ask." He looked at the stunned cabin, then at his wife. You two have been through enough. This will never happen again. Passengers nodded. One began to clap. Quietly, another joined, then another, within seconds. The cabin erupted in applause, not out of celebration, but out of sheer, stunned relief. Michelle exhaled and sat beside Kayla again, this time without fear. "You did it. Mom," Kayla whispered. "You didn't let them win." Michelle smiled faintly. "Neither did you." And as the cabin settled, and David began making calls to legal and operations, the crew who once ruled with arrogance stood silent, dismantled by the truth they had tried to ignore. "This is ridiculous," Lisa Harper blurted out, her voice trembling between panic and defiance as David Carter, the CEO of Skylux Airlines, stood firmly between his wife and the two flight attendants who had just tried to eject her. "There must be some mistake. She said she was your wife. But, how were we supposed to know?" Michelle didn't even blink. "You didn't want to know. That's the difference." Lisa's lips tightened, clearly fighting to regain authority that had already slipped through her fingers. "Sir," Sarah jumped in, trying to steady her tone. "We were just following protocol. We were told these seats were being reallocated for Mr. Wentworth." David turned to her slowly, jaw clenched. "That protocol ends today." He then looked at Lisa. "I want to hear from you. Why did you announce over the intercom that my wife and daughter didn't belong here?" Lisa stammered. "We were under the impression they were." "Impression?" Michelle cut in. "Or assumption?" The entire first-class cabin was watching, the energy brittle and quiet like a held breath. "I tried to tell you who I was. I showed you our tickets. And still, you mocked my daughter. You made her cry. You turned this cabin into a stage for humiliation," Michelle said, her voice low, composed, but cutting like glass. "You decided that we didn't belong, not because of our seats, but because of who we are." Charles Wentworth, standing awkwardly in the front of the cabin with his briefcase, interjected with a scoff. "Come on. This has gotten out of hand. Let's be reasonable." David turned toward him like a slow-moving wave. "Charles, you're still here?" Charles gave a tense chuckle. "I've invested millions into Skylux. One incident doesn't change that." "You're right," David replied. "It's not just one incident. It's years of quiet entitlement, of looking the other way, of saying the wrong thing and pretending it's fine. But not today. Not with my wife. Not with my daughter." Then, turning back to Lisa and Sarah, David asked flatly, "Did either of you verify the boarding manifest before you acted?" Lisa stayed silent. Sarah glanced down. "We didn't need to. Mr. Wentworth insisted those seats were his. So you took his word without question, but challenged my wife, in front of the entire cabin, even when she showed you a valid ticket?" David snapped. "That's not protocol. That's bias." Kayla, still seated with her mother, looked up. "Mom, I didn't do anything wrong, did I?" Michelle leaned down. "No, sweetheart. You did everything right. This isn't about you. It's about them." Lisa, now visibly sweating, tried to shift the blame. "We had no way of knowing. People lie about who they are all the time." "You called me a liar," Michelle said. "You told me I didn't belong. You didn't just question my presence. You erased it." Emma Larson stepped forward from her seat. "They made it public," she said, nodding toward Lisa. "They humiliated this family out loud, on the intercom, in front of us all, and now they want to walk it back?" "And they've done it before," Jaden Brooks added from the galley, voice stronger now. "She's made comments about me, told me I was lucky to be here, that I didn't match the Skylux image." David turned to him. "You filed a report?" Jaden nodded. It was ignored. David shook his head slowly, something in him shifting from fury to finality. Well, it won't be ignored anymore. Sir, Lisa tried again. This isn't fair. We were trying to keep order, to preserve the Skylux standard. You mean the illusion of exclusivity? Michelle snapped. The kind where we're only welcome if we look like your marketing poster? Lisa's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Charles stepped forward, waving a hand. Let's not blow this out of proportion. It was uncomfortable, sure. But this reaction? It's overkill. David looked directly at him. You've insulted my wife, my child. You've contributed to a hostile, racist environment inside my own company. So yes, Charles, it's proportionate. And your partnership with Skylux is officially terminated. You can leave now. Charles stared at him, mouth agape, then turned and stormed off toward the jet bridge without another word. The silence in his wake was louder than his footsteps. Michelle stood, adjusting her coat, looking directly at Lisa. You know what hurts the most? It wasn't even the words. It was how sure you were that I didn't belong. How comfortable you were saying it out loud. Lisa swallowed hard, mascara smudging under her eyes. No. Michelle stopped her. There's nothing you can say now that'll undo what you did. David turned toward the remaining passengers, his voice clear but firm. This flight is grounded until further notice. If anyone would like to disembark and reschedule, you may do so. We apologize for the inconvenience, but we will not allow this plane to depart with a broken moral compass. Emma sat down slowly, glancing at Michelle with a nod of quiet respect. Jaden remained standing, unsure of what came next, but visibly grateful someone had finally listened. Lisa tried one last time, voice shaky and uncertain. Sir, please don't fire us. It was a misunderstanding. We didn't know who she was. David stared at her. That's not the point. You didn't care to ask, and that's why you're done here. Sarah's posture folded inward, and Lisa finally turned away, heading toward the galley in silence. Michelle reached for Kayla's hand, gently squeezing it. It's over now, she whispered. You're safe. David pulled out his phone. Legal needs to prep paperwork tonight, he said to his assistant over the line. We're pursuing disciplinary action and potential claims of discrimination. Then he paused, glancing back toward his wife. Yes, I want a board meeting called first thing tomorrow, as he ended the call. Michelle leaned into him, not broken, but resolved. I want permanent change, she said. David nodded. We'll do it together. And as the flight crew cleared the cabin, and passengers slowly began to absorb what had just unfolded, one thing was clear. This wasn't just a disruption, it was a reckoning. Michelle Carter is my wife, Kayla is my daughter, and both of them were publicly humiliated by employees who work under my name. David's voice cut clean through the thick silence in the first-class cabin, clear, unshaken, and commanding. He stood beside Michelle and Kayla, facing the cabin crew who, only moments earlier, had tried to strip his family of dignity and belonging. Lisa Harper and Sarah Mitchell stood frozen, their polished uniforms doing little to protect them from the fallout they'd triggered. I want every passenger here to hear this, David continued, raising his voice just slightly, not out of rage, but out of deliberate control. This airline was founded on principles of excellence, but excellence means nothing if it isn't extended equally to every single person aboard. And what happened here today? He paused. Was not just a lapse in judgment. It was blatant discrimination. He turned his head toward Lisa. You embarrassed my wife in front of dozens of passengers. You questioned her ticket, her right to be here, her character. You ignored her words, dismissed her proof, and even mocked our 12-year-old daughter. Then you doubled down when challenged, and when the truth stared you in the face. You still refused to apologize. Lisa's lips parted, but no words came out. David didn't wait. Effective immediately. You are relieved of all duties. You are no longer employed by Skylux Airlines. A gasp rippled through the passengers, not out of surprise, because most of them expected this ending, but out of the surreal gravity of seeing justice delivered. Calmly and without hesitation, Sarah turned pale. "Sir, please, this isn't fair. We were following direction," Mr. Wentworth said. "Mr. Wentworth," David interrupted, "is no longer affiliated with this airline." He pointed toward the open jet bridge where Charles had recently stormed off. His partnership, his investments, his influence, all terminated. I'd rather lose a business deal than keep one built on entitlement and quiet racism. He turned to Sarah. "And you? You chose to echo Lisa's judgment. You smirked when my daughter cried. You taunted my wife instead of helping her. That is not service. That is cowardice dressed as protocol. You're done here." Sarah dropped her gaze, jaw quivering. But David wasn't finished. "This flight is grounded. I've ordered our operations team to delay departure until this situation is properly resolved. Every passenger on board will be rebooked or compensated. You deserve better than what happened here today." Several passengers nodded. A man in the third row muttered, "About time someone cleaned house." Emma Larson, still seated nearby, looked at Michelle and said, "We've got your back." Jaden Brooks, still standing just behind the curtain, visibly shaken but now more confident, stepped forward again. "Sir," he said, "if I may." David turned to him, giving him full attention. "Go ahead. I was told during training that I should blend in, that I should try not to stand out too much. Lisa told me that directly. I didn't know how to speak up. But today, I knew what I saw, and it wasn't right." David nodded. "You stood up when it mattered, and from today forward, you'll no longer be a trainee. You're being promoted to full-time." Jaden blinked, stunned, eyes misting. "Thank you, sir." David looked at his assistant, who had just entered the cabin from the front. "Notify legal. I want documentation ready within the hour. Lisa Harper, Sarah Mitchell, and Charles Wentworth will each be named in a formal internal discrimination report, and I want a press statement drafted before noon." The assistant nodded. "Already in motion." Michelle, still seated with Kayla beside her, looked up. Her voice was calm but firm. "This can't just be about firing a few people. This has to be the beginning of something bigger. Because this isn't new. It's just the first time it happened to someone whose husband has the power to stop it." David leaned down to her level. "I know. And we're going to fix it." Then, standing again, he addressed the cabin. "Skylux will be undergoing a full internal review, effective immediately. Every flight, every crew, every route. We will no longer tolerate assumptions about who belongs in first class, or anywhere else on this plane." Sarah stepped back, nearly stumbling as she reached for her service bag. Lisa turned toward the cockpit in a daze, eyes wide, her posture deflated. Passengers watched as they were quietly escorted off the aircraft. No one clapped, no one jeered. The moment didn't call for it. What settled in the air was deeper than victory. It was the quiet weight of truth taking hold. David returned to his wife and daughter, placing one hand on each of their shoulders. "I'm so sorry you went through that," he said softly. Michelle nodded. "I'm proud of how Kayla handled it." Kayla leaned against her mom, still shaken but steadier now. "Can we still go to Paris?" she asked quietly. David smiled gently. "Yes, we'll go. But on our terms, not theirs." Just then, one of the gate agents appeared with an update. "Sir, we've secured a private flight for your family within the hour. We've cleared all internal documentation as you requested. Thank you, David replied, then turning back to the remaining passengers. He added, anyone who wishes to rebook or speak to Skylux representatives will be personally accommodated. This disruption wasn't your fault, and we'll make it right. As the crowd began to murmur, some standing, others reaching for bags, one woman leaned over the aisle and said quietly to Michelle, "You changed something today." Michelle looked at her and smiled. Small, tired, but real. "I didn't mean to, but maybe it was time." David's assistant handed him a folder. "Board meeting scheduled for first thing tomorrow. Legal is drafting the lawsuit." David nodded. "Include a clause barring Lisa, Sarah, and Charles from any future employment or business with Skylux or its affiliates." "Done," the assistant said. Michelle stood, brushing off her slacks, and reached for her carry-on. "Let's go home for a bit," she told Kayla. "Then we'll go to Paris, and this time, we won't let anyone question where we belong." Kayla smiled, still holding her mom's hand. David stood beside them as they exited the cabin together. 3 silhouettes against the harsh morning light of the jet bridge, walking not just toward their flight, but toward change. The following morning, the boardroom on the 42nd floor of Skylux's Manhattan headquarters was unusually quiet. The incident from the day before had already made headlines. CEO's wife kicked out of first class. Skylux faces discrimination scandal. Corporate bias in plain sight. David Carter stood at the head of the long oak conference table, his face calm but stern as he addressed the board. "We're not here to protect the brand," he began, his tone measured. "We're here to fix what's broken." To his right, Michelle Carter sat composed, a file in front of her containing detailed witness statements from passengers, including Emma Larson's and Jaden Brooks's. To his left sat board chair Rachel Stein, along with longtime members Malik Carter and Elena Gomez. They had all watched the cabin footage. They had read the transcripts, and now it was time to act. Michelle leaned forward and spoke clearly. "I want it entered into the record that Lisa Harper and Sarah Mitchell are to be permanently banned from Skylux employment, and that Charles Wentworth's corporate privileges and access to any of our lounges, cabins, and events be revoked indefinitely." Rachel nodded without hesitation. "Approved. Their behavior wasn't just inappropriate. It was systemic. And if we're not addressing the root, we're complicit," Malik added. "This isn't about public image anymore. This is about company identity." Elena agreed. "We need a formal audit of all internal protocols, hiring practices, and bias training, and it needs to begin today." David glanced at his legal counsel. "Where are we on the lawsuit?" "Filed this morning," the counsel replied. "We've named all 3 individuals for defamation, discriminatory conduct, and violation of federal aviation and civil rights statutes. We've also requested a tribunal hearing and full discovery," Michelle added. "Make sure Jaden Brooks's statement is included in that filing. His testimony wasn't just courageous. It proved how deep this problem runs." By noon, news of the lawsuit had gone public. Outlets from CNN to the New York Times ran the headline with a still image of Michelle and Kayla in the first-class cabin. Passengers from the flight had already started giving interviews, many confirming what happened and praising how David and Michelle handled it. On social media, hashtags like #FlyFair, #SkyluxReform, and #NotJustASeat began trending. Though the Carters themselves remained silent, that silence wasn't weakness, it was strategy. David knew they needed action, not optics. Within hours, Skylux's stock dropped 15%, but the board stood by the Carters without wavering. "Temporary damage," Rachel said, reviewing investor reports. "We've seen worse from far less justifiable causes, and this time, we're leading with integrity." That afternoon, an internal memo went out to all Skylux employees, outlining new mandates, immediate anti-discrimination and racial bias retraining for all cabin crew, a zero-tolerance policy for service-based profiling, and a whistleblower hotline for flight staff to report internal misconduct. An idea Michelle had personally pushed for. Jaden Brooks was formally promoted that day to a full-time flight attendant, with a personal commendation from David and the board. His photo was quietly added to the internal employee spotlight bulletin with the caption, "Integrity starts with courage." Meanwhile, Charles Wentworth issued a half-hearted public apology through his law firm, blaming miscommunication and a moment of misunderstanding. But his words rang hollow. A deeper investigation revealed prior complaints from other passengers and junior employees over the past year. Incidents quietly dismissed under VIP protocol. That system, too, was suspended indefinitely. Michelle's push didn't end at terminations or policies. She drafted the foundation for what would become the Skylux Equity Initiative, a company-wide reform strategy including recruitment reviews, diverse hiring quotas for leadership, and a partnership with civil rights organizations to develop third-party oversight. "If this happened to me," she said to the board, "imagine how many others it's happened to who didn't have a CEO's business card in their pocket." Her words stuck. For the first time in the company's history, the conversation in that boardroom wasn't about revenue. It was about values, about how a premium airline couldn't call itself elite if it failed to treat every human being with basic dignity. And as the meeting wrapped, Rachel Stein stood and addressed the room with finality. "What happened yesterday was shameful, but what we do next, that's what we'll be remembered for." Everyone nodded. The decisions were unanimous, and by the end of the day, Skylux had begun its transformation, not because of a press crisis, but because one family refused to stay quiet. 3 months later, the skies over Paris were calm as Michelle Carter stepped onto the balcony of a quiet stone villa tucked in the Montmartre district, her daughter Kayla beside her, both wrapped in scarves and sipping warm cocoa as the autumn wind brushed past. It had taken time to get here, not just the miles, but the healing. What began as a simple trip had grown into something much bigger. Back home, Skylux Airlines had transformed. The company's new internal policy, the Skylux Equity Standard, had been fully implemented across every department. Anti-bias training was now mandatory. Crew evaluations included equity reviews, and the whistleblower hotline Michelle pushed for had led to several quiet investigations and dismissals. Lisa Harper and Sarah Mitchell had been officially banned from working in the airline industry through a collaborative effort with national aviation boards. Charles Wentworth's business credentials had unraveled, too, after more of his conduct came to light. His access to high-level partnerships dried up. But for Michelle, the victory wasn't about revenge. It was about restoration, about proving that what happened on that flight could lead to something better. News outlets had followed the story closely, especially after the lawsuit settlement. Skylux issued a public apology, paid damages to the Carters, and, more importantly, made structural change a headline, not just a footnote. At a leadership summit that fall, David introduced Michelle as the keynote speaker. She stood in front of a room of industry executives and said simply, "No company is immune to bias, but every company has the choice to confront it or cover it." Her words were later quoted in the Wall Street Journal and used in diversity training sessions across multiple airlines. Jaden Brooks, now a respected full-time crew member and trainer, began speaking publicly as well, often joining Michelle at forums and roundtables about equity in the aviation industry. Emma Larson, who had stood up for Michelle in the cabin, became an unofficial ambassador for the initiative, sharing her story to challenge others to speak up when something feels wrong. The movement that started with humiliation quietly became a national conversation. And at the heart of it all was a 12-year-old girl who had simply wanted to sit beside her mother on a flight to France. Kayla had changed, too. Not hardened, but wiser. At school, when the story broke. Some classmates didn't understand. Others did. And when one teacher invited her to speak at an assembly about what happened, she stood on stage and said, "I learned that some people will judge you before you say a word. But I also learned that speaking up can change everything." David listened from the back row, eyes wet with pride. On that trip to Paris, the family finally gave themselves what they'd originally planned: peace. They wandered through the Louvre together, Kayla dragging her parents toward each new painting. They walked arm in arm along the Seine. They ate too many pastries and stayed up late watching the Eiffel Tower sparkle. One night, as the city lights blinked through the mist, Michelle sat beside David on the balcony and said, "I didn't ask for any of this, but I'm glad we didn't stay silent." David took her hand. "You didn't just protect Kayla, you changed the whole industry." Michelle looked down at their daughter, asleep under a blanket on the couch behind them. "I just wanted her to know she belongs. Anywhere." That message, the idea of belonging, had become central to Skylux's new campaign. Billboards at airports now read, "Every seat deserves respect." The slogan wasn't crafted by a marketing firm. It came from Michelle's own words in that boardroom 3 months earlier. She didn't want to become a public figure. She didn't want her face in papers. But she knew that silence protects systems, and voices, even quiet ones, can break them. As the trip wound down, Kayla asked one final question at dinner. "Mom, do you think they really learned anything?" Michelle didn't answer right away. She looked across the table at David, then back at Kayla. "Some did. Some won't. But that doesn't mean we stop trying." Kayla nodded like she understood. And in that moment, it was clear. This story wasn't just about a flight. It was about dignity, legacy, and the kind of leadership that starts at 35,000 feet but lands in the hearts of people on the ground. As the family packed for home, Michelle folded one last note into her journal. It read, "We came for rest, but we found something bigger. May our daughter always know she never has to shrink to fit in." And with that, the Carters boarded a plane not as victims of bias, but as architects of change, quiet, steady, and unstoppable. If this story meant something to you, share it. Subscribe for more stories that stand up to injustice. And remember, your voice matters.